Our planes were shot at every single time.
Welcome to the ladies of Tellico Village. My name is Joan Dorsey, and this show features interviews with some of the most fascinating and talented women living right here in Tellico Village. I know you'll enjoy today's remarkable lady. Her story is special, her life has been remarkable, and I feel so honored to have her here today to share it all with us. Sit back and enjoy this episode brought to you by the volunteers at Tellico Village Broadcasting. I'm Joan Dorsey, and this is the Ladies of Tellico Village. Do I have a guest for you today? She's had the most amazing life. She's traveled the world. She has written 7 books, 4 of which we're going to talk about today. She has climbed Mount Kilimanjaro, and incidentally, all the way to the top. She has been rescued from a war zone in Cairo, Egypt, by the United States Navy, and she has experienced floods and blizzards and hail. I'd like to introduce my guest, Bobbi Phelps Chapman. I'm so glad you're here, and we are going to start your story with actually your most recent book, which is called Darien Waters. Now, tell me the significance of that title.
I grew up in Darien, Connecticut, 40 miles from New York City. The waters are because we were on Long Island Sound. The town was on Long Island Sound, and also numerous rivers went through, and Holly Pond was on one end of it. So a lot of water within the town of Darien.
You lived there with your mom and your dad and 2 sisters, but you were the middle sister, the well-adjusted middle child. Dad went to work every day in his office in Manhattan, New York City. What did Dad do?
He was in commercial real estate right in the heart of the Diamond District on 5th Avenue and 47th Street. And he managed 2 buildings. One was 52 stories, and the other one was 47 stories.
And Mom was a homemaker, but she did a lot of volunteer work, and she loved tennis. And you described her, interestingly enough, as a free spirit, which tells me you got a lot of vibes from your mom that showed up in your later life.
Definitely.
You lived in a very, very lovely home on a very lovely street, and you had friends and neighbors and kids that you played with, but you described your life as a dinner bell life. Can you briefly describe to me what a dinner bell life is? I think some of our younger viewers may not know.
One, when we finished with lunch, our parents would let us go outside and play, and we would play until we heard the dinner bell. And either we would hear it or our dogs would hear it. Either way, that's when we came home.
And it was so nice that they didn't have to worry about our safety or anything. We could just do our thing and come home when we were hungry or the dinner bell rang.
Or hurt.
Or hurt, that's true. And you've had some adventures with all kinds of things that we really can't cover today, but the one I really want you to tell me about is what you called in your book, the chapter, The Last Supper. That was such a hoot. I can't believe it.
My mother was definitely a free spirit, and we were, over Labor Day, we're going to go up to the northwest part of Massachusetts. She had it all planned, and off we went up to that section, all 5 of us in the car with our dog, Lucky. And there we came to a fire tower, and my dad said, "What? We're going to be having our picnic up here?" And sure enough, we had to climb 50 feet up a steep ladder. My younger sister was only 5 or 6. I was 8. My older sister was 10. And up this ladder we went to the very top, no rails. We sat there and had our lunch. And we called it the Last Supper because if anyone had fallen, we weren't going to live.
Oh my word. You completed school, 12 grades in Darien. In all those 12 years, did you do any writing? Was there any hint you were going to end up writing all these books?
Absolutely not. I wasn't interested in writing. All our professors in our town had their master's degree, and some had their doctorate. And this was in the 40s and 50s. And I was very interested in math. So math was my specialty because it was either right or wrong answer. English was not. It was up to the subject of the professor.
Okay. when you finished the 12th grade, you went to 2 separate schools.
But I chose Pine Manor in Wellesley, Massachusetts. And after that, I went to Catherine Gibbs Secretarial School because my father believed he would only pay for 2 years of education and then the girl was going to get married.
Well, the Catherine Gibbs served you very well when we get to a later part of your life. When you finished those 2 schools, though, you wanted to just take off. And of all places you wanted to go, the farthest away, you wanted to go to California. And you wanted to drive your car all the way, and your parents were a little nervous about that, so they found you a companion to travel with you. And after you dropped him off, I want you to tell me, as briefly as you can, what happened when you got into, was it San Francisco?
Not quite. It was after I dropped him off in Sacramento. I had now been driving all the way from Denver. I drove nonstop 16 hours from Denver into San Francisco, but as I was crossing the Oakland Bay Bridge, up until that point it was 60 miles an hour. As I crossed the bridge, the speed became 50 miles an hour. And at this point, my top flew off the car and went across a policeman's car that was clocking me for speeding on the Bay Bridge. So he slammed on his brakes because he couldn't see. I also pulled over because the top of my car came off. And then he came up to me, and I'm driving an MG, and it doesn't have outside handles. So his words to me were, "Open that GD door." And so I did, and he very nicely did not give me a ticket because I was crying like mad.
That always works.
After I cried my way out of the ticket, I went to the YWCA, and as I walked up the stairs and went to the receptionist's desk, I asked for a place to stay. I was running out of money, I had no friends and no job, and the top of my car had blown off. And at this point, the receptionist said, "I'm sorry, we just sold our last room." I went back to my car, crying like mad with my hands on the steering wheel, and these 2 girls came up to me and they said, "We heard your story, but if you'd like to live with us for 6 weeks, we'd love to have you." Without any other comment, I said, "Of course." And with that, I joined them, and that little encounter turned out to be 3 years living with them. But I still didn't have a job. So at this point, I went to the mayor of San Francisco. The only way I knew his name was at the introduction to the building. They have a list of their names. I went up to meet the mayor. Thank goodness he wasn't there, but I met his assistant who gave me a job that day in the secretarial pool.
So you lucked out and you found a place to live and some friends, and that was wonderful. And eventually you discovered World Airways. So for 6 years you were a stewardess. And there's a lot of curiosity about flying now as compared to then. It was referred to in your book as the glamorous years of flight. And I can remember when people got all dressed up to get on a plane. You know, they had on their best clothes, and the stewardesses were in their really nice uniforms that all matched and were tailored. And that has gone away. Now people sometimes even fly in their pajamas. But you connected up and you worked for Airways for a while, but you had a chance to apply to airline stewardess school. Now, what are some of the physical restrictions on somebody wanting to learn to be a stewardess and being accepted?
You had to be between 5'2" and 5'8", between the age of 21 and 28, not more than 135 pounds, and you couldn't be married.
What were some of the classes that you took, things that prepared you for actual flight?
The most important was health. We had to be able to resuscitate someone, also help with giving birth, and calming someone down, because most of the people flying at that time, it was their first time flying. Only 10% of Americans had ever been on an airplane before. Another one is you had to learn all the parts of the airplane, and you also had to learn about evacuations. And we did that in the the bay.
In fact, I think you in your book mentioned it was a class in ditching.
What happened was they put a raft out in the bay, and we as flight attendants or stewardesses were inside, and we took a knife from the container inside and sliced the rope that attached us to the airplane.
That was kind of at the end of your training. You finished. I'm just curious, just vague numbers, but how many started training and how many finished and actually graduated?
Only 50%.
So now tell me, where was your very first flight?
My first flight was to Japan.
Had you ever been to Japan before?
No, this was my first time. World Airways was an international company, so all my flights were international.
Okay. Did you make any big mistakes on your first time out?
Yes, I had to serve tomato juice, and the passengers were sailors in their white uniforms. Half of them ended up with tomato juice spilled on them.
Oh my. Oh, something interesting I either read in your book or something you told me casually during the interview, but stewardesses in those days didn't always push carts down the aisle.
We didn't have carts in the aisle. We had to carry trays, but they weren't overhead like this. They were in front of us, one above the other, going straight down the aisle. But you had to walk the whole way, going back and forth between the galley and your passengers.
You had some unusual accommodations when you would be somewhere and you would be laying over the night or for a couple of days, which I thought would be so wonderful if you had a layover in Paris to go shopping with the other stewardesses and buy a nice blouse. Or if you were laying over in Rome to go buy a nice pair of sandals or shoes. All the mementos that have come back from your worldwide travel that are all over this house. It's just so wonderful. And being a stewardess, able to bring them back and not have to mail them.
I think the most unusual thing I brought back was a monkey pod water buffalo that was about this big and about this high. And I brought it back from the mountains in the Philippines and put it on a seat in a bus and brought it back to the base.
Goodness.
But I think another unusual one was right before Christmas, we were in Japan, and the crew, back then you didn't have to pay for anything. They brought back one Jeep, numerous guns, and then all of us, and of course pearls and cameras because it was right before Christmas, but all of us bought hibachi, one of those green eggs.
Oh,
so
okay.
9 of them were in the belly.
Okay, now I want to ask you, does the Mile High Club really exist?
It does, but it only happened, as far as I know, on one flight for me.
How'd you deal with that?
Well, that was a group of students coming back from France. And yes, they were under a blanket copulating. And the other stewardess came along and ripped off the blanket. And that was how that one was.
Oh my goodness. What did the surrounding passengers think?
People weren't aware, and it was a night flight.
Now I want you to tell me about another flight, which I believe, I might be wrong because I've read so many wonderful adventures in this book, but you were on a flight going to Cairo, and you were alone, and they let you out, and then that plane apparently took off. You went in the airport at Cairo.
It was in June in 1967. I was traveling around the world by myself, and I had just left Pakistan. I didn't know, I hadn't seen any news. I didn't know that the United States had stopped all Americans going into Egypt. So I landed in Cairo. There were only 5 people getting off the airplane, and it was early in the morning. No one was at the airport. No one took our passports. Finally, we went to the baggage claim and picked up our luggage. I happened to mention or ask one of the other passengers where I could get a bus or whatever to go to the Hilton Hotel. And so he said, well, come with us. I have a limousine. And he took me to the Hilton Hotel.
So tell us about this adventure in Cairo once you had landed.
Well, the following day after the Hilton Hotel, I went to American Express. That was a very typical thing traveling. At that time, that's where you received your mail. You connected with other young people and then would find a youth hostel. At this one, it was absolutely empty. There was no one in the building. And I went through going, hello, hello, and finally I found a man at the very end, and he said, what the heck are you doing here? And at this point, I explained my situation, flying around the world by myself and just coming in from Pakistan, and I had no idea that Egypt was closed to American tourists. This is Saturday morning, and he took me back to the Hilton and introduced me to the manager, and he said, you keep an eye on her. This was a good-looking guy, young Australian, who spoke 5 languages, and I was pleased as could be to be overlooked by this fella.
Okay.
He asked me if I'd like to go sailing that day, and so I went sailing on the Nile with him. That night, he took me out into the desert, and we went to see the Sans-Lumière, which is a sound and lights. No one was there but this fella and me. And then the following day, Monday morning, 9 o'clock, air raids went off. People knocked on my door and took me. I was on the 8th floor. They took me down 8 outdoor flights down to the basement. Diplomats, business people were all locked up in the Hilton Hotel. We had to stay there until the all clear. We didn't know at all what was going on, but we found out that Israel had just bombed Cairo, and they had destroyed all the airplanes in all the bases of Egypt. And this was the start of the 6-day war.
I guess you never plan on being in the middle of a war when you've been trained to be an airline stewardess. However, you did ultimately, in the end of all this excitement, you were saved by the United States Navy, which got you out of the war zone and got you to safety.
We had to leave Cairo and go to Alexandria. We were then rescued by the 6th Fleet, and they came in and took us back to Greece across the Mediterranean. I was the only American tourist and the only female among media men, businessmen, and diplomats.
That sounds interesting in itself. All right, after that daring experience, you've had some other very interesting flights that aren't things you can really plan for. But there was one chapter in here where you told about a child that was born during flight.
Yes, it was a young woman from the Philippines. She didn't speak English, but she was married to a young Navy sailor, and they were coming back to the States. And we didn't know anything about this, but she went into the restroom, and when she was there, she passed out. So the restroom was occupied, and I knocked on the door numerous times, and we have a latch that we can undo the bathroom door even though it's locked. So I undid it, looked in, and here she's sitting on the toilet, but passed out. Myself and a couple other stewardesses picked her up. We made a bed out of the last row of seats, put her on that, and then we asked if a medic was on board. He told us she had just given birth, but there was no baby. So he went back into the bathroom and put his hand in the toilet and pulled out a 7-month term baby.
I guess they did give you a lot of health and tips on things like that, but did you ever have a course that prepared you for that?
Oh, absolutely not.
Oh, yeah,
no,
that's what I thought.
You just have to.
You also flew into Vietnam on a regular basis.
Yes, our flights would come in and we would be very high, and then right as we started to land, I landed in 4 different airports. The worst one was Da Nang, and when we would come in, we'd have to go high and then straight down onto the runway. And when we got there, one of the soldiers came on. He demanded immediately that we evacuate the airplane. So here we are running across the tarmac. At this time, we had heels on because we were evacuating, and we had to hide in bunkers. But our planes were shot at every single time. And when they would hit the fuselage, the cockpit crew would walk around the airplane and put what we called duct tape, but it was really speed tape, across the holes until we got back to Japan.
Oh my
and then
goodness.
they'd be professionally covered.
Well, shortly after all of these worldwide adventures that you had, you made a decision to go back to the United States. And in fact, you looked up a young man you had dated in college.
University of California at Berkeley.
At Berkeley. And you two kind of paired up. He was a writer now, I believe, for sports magazines. And he loved fly fishing. And you had really mastered photography with all these travels. So you paired up and ultimately you married.
Yes.
And you decided to take a long, was it 18 months?
Yes.
Trip around the world. You were going to do it again, but with him, and you did. And that brings me back to this book, Black Empress. I believe some of the times in the book you've mentioned, and there were many adventures you had, but you mentioned that you met a couple and you spent some time with them, and they had sounded like a farm, but they had a dog that had just had a litter of puppies. Tell me the status of dogs in Iran.
It's not very good. They believe that pets, cats and dogs, are not something to be tolerated. They actually kill them. So the family didn't have a farm. They had a compound, very high walls around about 12 feet high with razor wire around the top. And yes, the mother dog just had puppies. And this little puppy, Bahrain, right here, she was the runt of a litter, and they were going to kill her. They were going to drown her the very first day I got there. She is 5 days old, and I said, let me try and save her. And so with the owner's wife, she and I went to the bazaar, and we found all sorts of things to feed the puppy. We did save her. She ended up being fed and saved and brought back to the States, and eventually lived to be 14 years old.
14 years old. Just briefly, relate to our audience the cab ride to the airport to put her in a crate and send her to your parents, who were, because you were still going to continue traveling. So tell about the cab ride.
The cab came to my compound, or to the compound, and at this point, the cab driver did not want this dog in the cab. He wanted it in the trunk. Well, it's a 3-month-old puppy. There was no way I was going to put it in the trunk. And so we bribed him, and he ended up taking the puppy, who had to be on my lap. However, the veterinarian had given me some medicine, and he said half the dosage because the flight was 19 hours. I misunderstood, and I doubled the dosage. This little puppy made a mess all over my clothes, and the cab driver had a fit, screaming and yelling at me in Farsi, pulled to the side of the road. The puppy and I got out. He could have left us right there. I was in the middle of nowhere with this dog who had gotten sick all over my clothes. And anyway, we cleaned everything off. We got back into his taxi cab and made it to the airport, and it looked like I was sending a dead dog back to the States.
And the dog lived with you and your husband for 14 years. You and your husband did return to the USA and collect your dog. You had formed a company that became an award-winning company, and it was called the Angler's Calendar and Catalog Company. So you worked on that, and it became a fabulous company with many, many awards. And he worked on his writing. You both enjoyed fly fishing, and you enjoyed your photography. Ultimately, you each were so involved in your separate careers, and eventually the relationship did end and you divorced. And that was the beginning of a move you made that brought this story into light. The next time we meet, we're going to see chapter 2 of Bobbi Phelps Chapman's life. And I guarantee you it'll be just as much fun as the first was. See you then.